Watch what a man does, not what he says, my grandmother always told me. I wish I listened before I fell for the sweetest words I've ever heard from the coldest man I've ever known. Hi, I'm Rowan, and I often wonder why we cling so tightly to words, as if saying something beautiful is the same as meaning it, living it, proving it. I believed for a long time that the right phrase could soften any blow, mend any gap. But love, I've learned, lives in what you do, not what you say. I hope you learn from my story. All right, let's dive in, and please do not forget to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this story. It was the sound of the peel breaking that I remember most, the soft, wet rip as my grandmother's thumb dug into the orange skin. We were sitting on the porch, just the two of us, as the sky simmered with that dusky, golden stillness that always made everything feel suspended. She handed me a slice before she spoke, her voice low and calm. Watch what a man does, she said, as if she were commenting on the weather, not what he says. I was 13, maybe 14. At that age where romantic ideas lived in music lyrics and schoolyard secrets. I didn't know what she meant, not really. I thought love lived in poems and grand confessions. I wanted a boy who'd write me letters, send me messages at midnight that said, I was just thinking of you. I didn't care what he did, I wanted words. Beautiful ones. She didn't argue. She just peeled another orange, quiet and certain. I remember that. The silence between us wasn't awkward, it was full. Her presence was always like that. Gentle, sure, waiting for me to grow into the truths she already knew. At the time, I thought she was wrong. How could someone say all the right things and not mean them? I didn't understand how action and intention could live in two different rooms. I didn't know yet that someone could say, I miss you while standing you up, or say, I'll be there without even checking their calendar. But I would learn, eventually. The older I got, the more I chased after eloquence in others and in myself. I confused vulnerability with eloquence. I thought if someone could say something soft, it meant they felt something real. I didn't see the gaps, the skipped phone calls, the missed milestones, the delayed apologies. And when Nolan came into my life, with his quiet smile and perfect timing, I thought I'd finally found what I'd always wanted. He knew just what to say. Every compliment, every apology, every little thinking of you was wrapped in poetry. But now, when I look back, I remember what my grandmother said. I remember the orange peels. And I remember that nothing he ever said could have filled the space he never occupied. I was 17 the first time I mistook pretty words for permanence. His name was Sean. He wasn't particularly handsome, but he had that boyish grin and a way with gum wrappers. Every lunch break, he'd slide one across the table with a scribbled poem on the inside. Short ones, silly ones. Sometimes, a line from a song we both liked. I kept every single one in an old shoebox under my bed, convinced that this was what love looked like. I remember showing my grandmother one once. We were in the kitchen, and I held it up proudly like it was proof of something sacred. She read the tiny lines, nodded, and said, "It's nice that he writes." That was all. No gushing, no follow-up questions. Just that steady, unreadable expression as she turned back to the kettle. I waited for her to say more, to co-sign my little fantasy, but she didn't. Instead, she handed me a plate and asked if I wanted tea. Later that night, I sat on the porch again, this time alone, rereading Sean's latest rapper. You laugh like wind on water, it said. At the time, it felt like the most romantic sentence ever written. I held it against my chest and whispered his name once under my breath, just to hear how it sounded in the air. My grandmother opened the screen door and joined me without a word. She sat beside me with her crocheting, the light from the porch casting soft shadows on her hands. After a long silence, she said, "Words are easy, Rowan. They're just breath, watch what he does." "But he writes poems," I argued gently, a little too defensively. She gave a soft hum. "And when it rains, does he bring you a coat? When you're quiet, does he ask why?" She didn't wait for an answer. "Words fade. You want someone who'll notice you before you speak." I didn't listen then. Not really. I tucked that line in the same box as the poems, something pretty but unnecessary. Something wise but irrelevant. I was too enamored with love that rhymed. Love that could be folded and kept. It would take years and someone much colder for those words to finally land. Sean eventually faded. just like the ink on those wrappers, but my need for beautifully spoken love didn't. It followed me into adulthood, clung to me like a language I was too fluent in to abandon. That's how Nolan found me, fluent in softness, hungry for the kind of love that lived in what people said, not what they did. I met Nolan at a book signing. He wasn't the author, just another face in the line just ahead of me. We started talking while waiting, something about the author's older works being better, about metaphors being abused these days. I liked his voice. It was warm, smooth. He said things like, "That line felt like it was written for people who have been quietly broken." And I remember thinking, finally, someone who speaks my language. When the line moved, he waited for me to get my book signed, then walked with me to the corner where I parked. "You read like someone who feels everything too loudly," he said, holding eye contact the whole time. My stomach flipped. Not because of what he said, I'd heard variations of that before, but because he made it sound like a compliment, not a burden. The first few weeks were a dream. Long messages, full of inside jokes and lyrical lines. He quoted poetry when I couldn't sleep, texted me first every morning. We'd talk for hours about books, music, childhood things. He had this way of making me feel like I was the only person in the world who truly understood him. He listened, asked deep questions, repeated things I said days later like he'd memorized them. It was intoxicating. The first red flag didn't even look red. He was late to our third date, not just a few minutes late, but almost an hour. He didn't text, didn't call. When he arrived, breathless and apologetic, he brought a small book of Rumi poems. "Saw this and thought of you," he said, and I melted. Just like that, I didn't ask where he'd been. The next time he canceled on me last minute, it was because he was emotionally overloaded. He wrote a beautiful apology that ended with, "When I think of you, the noise in my head quiets. Please forgive my absence. I promise I'll show up better next time." How could I be angry when he gave me poetry instead of explanations? Little things kept happening. He forgot my favorite kind of tea after I told him 3 times. He never remembered my lunch breaks, but somehow remembered the quote I posted in my Instagram story a month ago. I started to realize Nolan paid attention to what could be performed, the details that sounded good, not the ones that required effort. Still, I kept making excuses. Maybe he's overwhelmed. Maybe his love language was different. Maybe I just needed to be more patient. I was still mistaking charm for care. And it hadn't yet occurred to me that some people only show up in words because that's where they feel safest. Because words don't cost them anything. There was a time Nolan's messages felt like lifelines. He'd send long texts after midnight, unspooling thoughts like ribbon. "You're the only one who gets it," he'd write. Or, "I wish the world felt more like you, soft, honest, unafraid." He sent poems he'd written, voice notes where his voice dropped to a murmur, saying my name like it was a secret. I saved them, replayed them. They felt like evidence that this was real. And it was, in that version of reality where effort could be faked with eloquence. When we were apart, I felt close to him. But when we were together, something always felt slightly misaligned. He'd forget little things, show up flustered or tired, check his phone mid-conversation. I'd laugh it off and say things like, "You're lucky you're poetic or I'd strangle you." He'd smile and kiss my forehead and say, "You love it." But I didn't. There were times I needed more than pretty words. The night I got the job promotion, for example, I'd been working toward it for months, and when I finally got the call, I texted him immediately. No reply, not even hours later. I imagined him planning something, maybe a surprise dinner, something thoughtful. He called me the next morning. "Congrats, baby," he said, voice thick with sleep. "I'm proud of you." That was it. No dinner, no card. No effort to even see me that weekend. I didn't say anything. I told myself maybe I was expecting too much. That not everyone celebrates the same way. Then there was the night I came over with wine and takeout, a spontaneous little celebration I planned. He was distracted, half watching a documentary on his laptop. I handed him the bottle. He smiled and said, "You're sweet," but never opened it. Later that night, when I curled against him and whispered, "You make me feel invisible sometimes," he pressed a kiss to my hair and replied, "Don't be silly. You're the center of my world." And that was the problem. His lips knew all the right choreography, but his hands were always empty. The apologies, the metaphors, the whispered reassurances, they felt like gifts, but they were air. Light enough to lift me, but never solid enough to hold me. I began to wonder, was I in love with Nolan or just the way he talked about love? The distinction felt small until it wasn't. It was supposed to be one of the happiest nights of my life. I'd worked 12-hour days for weeks, led a cross-functional campaign no one thought I could handle, and finally, my boss announced I was being promoted to lead strategist. Clara hugged me tight in front of everyone. My team clapped. Even the usually aloof director stopped by to say, "Well earned." I was glowing, high on adrenaline and quiet pride. I texted Nolan 3 words, "I did it." No reply. I waited. An hour passed. Then another. Clara and I went out to dinner to celebrate. She ordered champagne. I kept checking my phone under the table. By the time dessert came, I'd convinced myself he was planning something, a surprise maybe, or just choosing the perfect words. When I got home that night, my apartment was dark. No candles, no note, no Nolan, just an unread message bubble sitting in our thread, green and solitary. The next morning, he called. "Hey," he said, like we hadn't skipped a beat. "How was the big day?" I swallowed the sting. It went well. "Of course it did." He chuckled, voice warm and familiar. "You always kill it. Proud of you, babe." I waited for a dinner invite. A plan to come over. A suggestion. Anything. Nothing came. Later that week, I dropped by his place with a bottle of red wine and a little card that said, "To the person who always believed in me." He glanced at it, smiled lazily, and said, "That's cute." Then he set it on his cluttered desk and didn't mention it again. We sat on his couch while he scrolled through his emails. I waited for him to ask about the campaign, about the night, about how it felt. Instead, he turned to me and said, "Do you want to watch something?" That was the first time I realized Nolan never actually showed up for me. Not when it mattered. Not when I wasn't falling apart but rising. He loved to be the one who comforted, not the one who celebrated. It hit me in waves that night. He'd said all the right things, but had done nothing at all. And I remembered what my grandmother once said, not sharply, but as if reciting a truth too old to question. "Baby, any man can talk, but only a few are willing to show up with their hands full." Nolan's hands had always been empty. It started with a dizzy spell in the shower. Not a dramatic collapse, just a tilt, a sudden heaviness in my limbs. I sat down on the tiled floor, heart pounding, hand pressed to the cool porcelain wall. I told myself it was stress, the long nights, the skipped meals, but something felt off. Foreign. I booked an appointment with my doctor, half out of precaution, half out of quiet fear. The clinic ran tests. Nothing urgent, they said, but they'd call back after the blood work. I texted Nolan while sitting in the parking lot, the sun too bright, my skin too clammy. "Hey, just had a health scare, going to rest. I'll explain later." He responded in under a minute. "Let me know how it goes." That was it. 3 days passed. No check-ins, no calls, no knocking at my door. He posted a story dinner with his friends at some rooftop bar. He retweeted a quote about loyalty and trust. He sent a meme to our group chat. But me, the woman he said he loved, I was recovering alone, drinking ginger tea, watching reruns in silence, waiting for the phone to buzz. It never did. When the clinic called back, the nurse said my cortisol levels were elevated and asked if I'd been under emotional stress. I laughed a little too hard and replied, "I think so." That evening, as I watered the small basil plant on my windowsill, I scrolled up through Nolan's messages. Dozens of sweet words, promises, nicknames, my girl, my heart, the one. But none of those words had shown up at my door. No soup, no flowers, not even a call. My grandmother had once told me that the man who brings you a glass of water when you're too weak to stand loves you more than the one who writes you 1,000 poems about thirst. And as I wrapped myself in a blanket that night, legs curled against my chest, I realized Nolan wasn't absent because he didn't know what to do. He was absent because he didn't want to be there when love asked for something inconvenient. I didn't start the conversation like I usually did, gentle, padded, layered in disclaimers. I was too tired for softening. We sat across from each other at the little restaurant where he'd suggested we meet after work. His fork scraped the plate as he twirled his pasta, relaxed, humming to a song playing overhead. I watched him for a long moment before speaking. "I had that health scare last week," I said, not as a reminder, but as a marker. He glanced up. "Right, you okay now?" "I am," I said, letting the silence between us breathe. But it was scary. I was dizzy in the shower. They ran tests. It could have been serious. He blinked slowly. "Yeah, sorry I didn't follow up. I figured if it was something major, you'd say something." I stared at him, words snagged in my throat. "I did say something. I told you I wasn't okay. You told me to let you know how it goes." And then nothing. He shrugged, pushing his plate slightly to the side. "I didn't think you needed me to babysit you. You're strong, Ro, you don't fall apart." The way he said it, as if emotional support was something reserved for the visibly broken, made my chest ache. "I wasn't asking to be bobbied," I said, voice calm but fraying. "I was scared. I needed someone to care enough to ask if I was okay." He leaned back, arms folded. "I care, you know I do. But sometimes you make it hard to know what you want. You didn't say, 'Call me' or 'Come over.' You just said you'd rest." I exhaled sharply. I didn't think I had to script concern for you. His gaze faltered. "Okay, so maybe I missed it. Maybe I dropped the ball, but don't act like I never show up. I'm always there when you're upset, when things are heavy. I hold space for you." "Words, Nolan, you hold space with words." He frowned. "Why does that suddenly not count?" "Because words don't help when you're dizzy in a shower, or waiting for a call that never comes." He stared at me for a long time, jaw tightening. Then he softened his tone like a man switching tactics. "You're right, I should have done more. I get overwhelmed too, you know? I didn't want to say the wrong thing or show up and mess it up somehow. But I love you. You know I love you." He reached across the table and touched my hand. And in that moment, I almost believed him. Again. Because Nolan had mastered the art of saying the perfect thing just in time to stop me from walking. But as I looked at our fingers, barely touching, I wondered if love should ever need this much saving. Clara noticed before I said a word. We were back in the office, surrounded by the faint hum of printers and the occasional shuffle of paper. She caught me lingering too long at the coffee machine, stirring a cup I wasn't drinking. When I sat down at my desk, she leaned over the partition and spoke just above a whisper. "You okay?" I nodded, but it was the kind of nod that lacked weight. She didn't push. Clara never did. That was part of what made her easy to talk to. She gave you silence like a gift, not a threat. Later that day, she stopped by with a stack of reports and almost as an afterthought asked, "Is Nolan coming to the team dinner next week?" I hesitated. "Probably not. He's been swamped with work." She gave a small smile, not unkind. "He's always swamped, isn't he?" I looked up, searching her face for judgment, but found none. Just curiosity wrapped in care. "He doesn't really do work stuff," I said. "Not mine, anyway." Clara raised an eyebrow. "But yours is half your life." I didn't reply. Not because I disagreed, but because I didn't have a defense that didn't sound like an excuse. Nolan had never once shown up to anything related to my job, no team mixers, no gallery fundraisers, not even the art showcase I helped organize last year. He always had a reason, and I always accepted it. "Rowan," Clara said softly, "can I ask something?" I nodded. "Does he ever make you feel poured into? Not told, not texted, just shown?" The question hit harder than I expected. I blinked, forcing my face to stay still. "He's just not the expressive type." Clara tilted her head. "Neither was my ex, until I realized he was just not with me." That sentence stayed with me the rest of the day. At home, I sat on the couch, scrolling through my camera roll. Almost every picture of Nolan and me had been taken by me. Almost every caption read like I was convincing myself we were okay. I thought about what Clara said, about being poured into, and then I looked at the couch beside me, empty again, even though he'd promised he'd be over. It wasn't that he didn't care, it was that he didn't show it. And I was starting to realize how lonely that kind of love could be. I started trying harder, not out of hope, but habit. It felt like second nature to fill in the blanks, to compensate for the lopsidedness with more intention, more softness, more plans. I bought tickets to a jazz night I thought he'd love. I picked a restaurant I knew he mentioned once offhandedly, 6 months ago during a drive. I even sent a message saying, "No pressure. Just thought this would be nice." He replied the next morning with a thumbs up. The night came and he arrived 20 minutes late. No apology, just a casual, traffic was hell, and a quick kiss on the cheek that felt more like habit than affection. I didn't say anything. I just folded my napkin neatly and made sure my voice stayed pleasant. He ordered steak. Barely asked me about my day. When I brought up a new art project I was planning, he nodded, said, "That's cool," then asked if I'd watched the new action series on Netflix. I tried not to let my face drop. I smiled, sipped my wine, changed the subject. Back home, I lit a candle beside the bed. He was already scrolling through his phone. "I like spending time like that," I said quietly. Dinner, just being out together." He didn't look up. Yeah, it was fine. That word fine rang like an insult, a dismissal. I stared at the ceiling for a while after he fell asleep, and in the morning I woke up first. I made the bed around him, left a cup of coffee by his side of the sink. No thank you message ever came. I didn't expect one. That was the problem. Every gesture I made started to feel like a test I already knew the answer to. Not because I thought he'd fail, but because I'd finally realized he wouldn't even notice the test was happening. And that night, while brushing my teeth, I looked at my own reflection and whispered a question I hadn't allowed myself to ask in months. Why am I always the one trying? My grandmother died on a Sunday. It was early. I'd barely made it to the kettle before the phone rang. I already knew. Some part of me had known for days the silence in her calls, the way she'd trailed off mid-sentence the last time we spoke. Her neighbor had called, said she passed peacefully, said she looked like she was sleeping. I sat on the kitchen floor, not crying, not yet, just still. When Nolan called that afternoon, it wasn't because he remembered the date. It was a routine check-in. "How's your Sunday?" he asked. I said, "My grandmother died." He paused, then he whispered, "Oh no." The next few minutes were filled with beautiful sentences. How much he knew she meant to me, how grief is love with nowhere to go, how she sounded like a remarkable woman. His voice cracked at the right places. He promised he'd come by that evening. He didn't. At 7:43 p.m., I received a text, got caught up with some stuff. "I'll call you tomorrow." Promise. I stared at the screen until it dimmed. Then I stared at the wall. The funeral was set for Wednesday, closed casket. I didn't have the energy to argue when the pastor mispronounced her middle name. I stood by the coffin like a statue, thanking strangers in polite whispers, searching each face for something steady. Nolan wasn't one of them. He sent flowers. They arrived in a beige box delivered by a teenager who couldn't meet my eyes. Inside was a note. "She would be proud of the woman you've become." Nolan. No cardstock, just a printout. Elise held my hand through the service. Clara helped gather chairs. And me, I kept thinking about how much effort it takes to write something that beautiful and how little it takes to show up. That night, I held her old sweater to my chest and let grief pull me under. Not just for her, but for the version of myself that once mistook pretty words for presents. I stayed in my grandmother's house for 3 days after the funeral. The porch still smelled like lemon polish and dry wood. Her sweaters still held the faint scent of jasmine. I didn't answer Nolan's messages. I didn't have the strength to be soothed by his voice anymore. I needed silence, the kind my grandmother had mastered. The fridge was still full of meals she'd prepared in advance. Her handwriting was taped to jars, labeling everything from carrot stew to berry compote. She never said, "I love you" out loud. But she showed it in recipes, in quiet glances, in porch light that stayed on late until I got home. On the third evening, I found her journal, tucked between bills and a pack of sewing needles. I shouldn't have opened it, but I did. There wasn't much, scattered reflections in short, clipped sentences. One read, "Words are a promise. But action is the fulfillment. Don't let a man decorate your life with empty language." Another, Rowan talks about him like he's a poet. But does he bring her soup when she's sick? I laughed through the tears, because no, he didn't. When I had the flu, Nolan sent a link to a tea he recommended. And that was it. I hadn't realized how much of me had been waiting for him to become real, to become present. But grief peeled away the softness I once used to cover his absence. By the time I returned to the city, I didn't want to talk. Not yet, not to him. I wanted to remember my grandmother fully, without Nolan's voice wrapped around my sadness like a ribbon. I went to the closet and packed the scarf she knitted me last winter. I put it in my top drawer, a reminder that love, real love, doesn't arrive with a speech. It shows up with a coat when it's cold, a hand when you're trembling, a chair beside yours at a funeral. Nolan didn't show up, but I did, for myself. The funeral was quiet, just the way she would have wanted. It was held in the small church at the edge of the neighborhood, where the pews creaked with every movement, and the air smelled faintly of lavender oil and candle wax. I wore the navy dress she'd once complimented, the one with tiny flowers along the hem. Clara came. So did my uncle, a few neighbors, and one of her old friends from the garden club who carried a bouquet of tulips because, she said, Louise always loved spring things. Nolan did not come, he sent flowers. A large, carefully arranged bouquet of pale pink lilies with white roses, delivered by a stranger who handed them to the church usher without asking for my name. I found them later, after the service, in the hallway near the guest book. There was a card attached, elegant cursive that said, "She was a light. I'm so sorry. Love, Nolan." That was all. I stared at it too long. Not because the message was cruel, it wasn't, but because it wasn't him. It wasn't his voice. It was a gesture outsourced. A performance staged through a florist app. I could almost see him, phone in one hand, credit card in the other, searching sympathy flowers and choosing whatever looked appropriately somber. He hadn't called that morning, hadn't texted to ask if I was okay. No, how are you holding up? No, do you want me there? Just flowers. Expensive, beautiful, and achingly hollow. I slipped the card into my coat pocket and walked back into the sanctuary, where Clara was waiting with a warm cup of tea and a look that told me she hadn't seen him either. She asked quietly, "You okay?" I nodded, but I felt something shifting, not just because of grief, but because of what grief revealed. My grandmother was gone. Her voice would only live in memory now, and Nolan hadn't even tried to show up. He always said the right things, but he wasn't there to help me into my coat, wasn't there to hold my hand, wasn't in any of the empty seats I kept glancing at during the service. I left the church with a headache and a heart that was tired of apologizing for people who promised warmth and only sent flowers. I found myself back on the porch that evening, alone with the quiet. The same porch where my grandmother used to peel oranges, slice them in perfect spirals, and hand me wedges while I sat on the steps pretending not to listen to her wisdom. That memory had become a loop in my mind, her voice, soft but firm, saying, "Watch what a man does, not what he says." At the time, I'd rolled my eyes. I thought she was just being old-fashioned. But now it landed differently. Now it felt like prophecy. I replayed every sweet thing Nolan had ever said to me. The poetry, the promises, the paragraphs of love-laced texts sent after every argument. He was always apologizing for his tone, his lateness, his forgetfulness. He had a way with words. But where had that ever gotten me? I was alone, at my grandmother's funeral, with a bouquet and a card. He didn't hold my hand when I made arrangements. He didn't ask how I slept the night she passed. He didn't drive over. He didn't knock on the door. It wasn't anger I felt anymore, it was understanding. Clarity. Like someone had wiped a fogged mirror. Nolan had never shown up in my life the way I needed him to. He had shown up in paragraphs, in emojis, in planned calls that he sometimes forgot. But he never showed up in presence. In the moments that mattered, I used to mistake his eloquence for intimacy, his pretty apologies for growth. But I realized now words are wind. They can circle you, comfort you, even cool you down. But they pass through. They don't stay. They don't sit beside you on pews. They don't stand behind you when you can't walk alone. I sat on that porch and peeled an orange. My hands were slower than hers had been, less sure. But as the skin loosened and the citrus burst beneath my nails, I finally understood. This was the lesson she had been trying to give me all along. Love isn't in what they say. It's in what they do when no one's watching. It's in who shows up when the words run dry. I didn't tell Nolan anything. I didn't confront him or cry or send a passive-aggressive message to see if he'd pick up the hint. I just started watching. Closely. Silently. As if every word from him had become background noise, and now I was tuning into a different frequency, one that tracked only behavior. He texted that night. "Thinking about you. Let me know if you want to talk. I didn't reply, not because I was punishing him, but because I'd heard it before. That exact line, almost word for word after my grandmother's first hospital stay, after my first panic attack, after my work presentation where he forgot to ask how it went. He said it then, and he did nothing. He said it again now, and I knew he would do nothing again, so I watched. I watched as 3 more days passed with no phone call. I watched as he posted a meme on his story about not knowing how to support people sometimes, but loving them deeply. I watched how he liked my cousin's engagement post, but didn't even check in on my grief. I started listing things down, not obsessively, not in some vindictive tally sheet, just for myself. A reminder of what I couldn't unsee anymore. Monday, he promised to call before bed. Didn't. Tuesday, liked 4 of my tweets. Didn't ask how therapy went. Wednesday, texted how are you? At 2 a.m. while drunk, no follow-up. Meanwhile, Clara had dropped off soup. My aunt had driven 2 hours to sit with me. My neighbor, Mr. Ellery from 2 doors down, offered to mow my lawn. And Nalen, he sent another card, this one digital. A thinking of you e-card with a piano soundtrack and some quote about time healing all wounds. I had to laugh. Not because it was funny, but because this was the same man who once told me he wasn't the type to do surface-level stuff. And yet, everything he did now skimmed the surface of who I was and what I needed. I realized something. Nalen had trained me to expect so little. I once mistook crumbs for care. And now I had to retrain myself not just to want more, but to notice when someone wasn't even trying. The reckoning wasn't loud. It didn't come with a bang or a betrayal. It came in the quiet observation of a pattern I could no longer ignore. And once I started watching, I couldn't stop. Leaving didn't feel like some grand awakening. It wasn't a dramatic suitcase slam or a tearful goodbye. It was quiet, methodical, the way you clean out a drawer when you know you're never coming back to it. I packed the essentials, clothes, books, a few framed photos of Gran, and left the rest. The coffee mug I once bought him, the sweater he liked on me, the tiny note he once scribbled on a napkin that I'd stupidly taped to my mirror for a year. Gone. I didn't feel angry. Just done. I didn't leave him a speech. I didn't text some final message he'd screenshot for his friends and twist into a joke. I didn't even block him. I knew he'd come looking for answers in the same place he always did, in my inbox. But I didn't want to argue about what he meant versus what he did. So I left a note, just one line. Watch what a man does, not what he says. I folded it in half, placed it on his pillow, and closed the door behind me like I was walking out of a classroom after the final exam. No need to look back, I already knew the results. The silence that followed was startling. For so long, Nalen's noise had filled my head, his beautiful words, his explanations, his sorry I forgots. But now there was room, air, space for my own thoughts, my own voice. I moved in with Clara for a while. She didn't ask questions when I showed up with a bag and swollen eyes. She just handed me the spare key and said, "Welcome back to your own life." And just like that, I did. I started rebuilding it. Slowly, softly, without commentary. The mornings were the hardest. I'd instinctively reach for my phone, expecting the usual paragraph from Nalen, some sweet nothing, some thinking about you, some expertly crafted apology. But there was nothing. And that silence, instead of hurting, became comforting. No more clinging to what sounded like love but never showed up. It was strange how much peace came from absence. I stopped romanticizing potential. I stopped waiting for someone to change. I stopped confusing explanation with accountability. And when Clara found the note I'd written and left behind, she laughed gently. You used his favorite thing, words, to finally walk away. I smiled, because this time the words were mine. The messages started pouring in 2 days later, a paragraph-long apology, then another. Then a voice note, his tone tender, almost trembling, as if he'd finally realized something he couldn't undo. I messed up, I know that, but I miss you, I miss us. Please just talk to me. It was always that, talk to me. But I'd spent so long talking, explaining, clarifying, translating my feelings into digestible little bites so he wouldn't choke on the truth. I was done feeding him softness he never reciprocated. Then came the flowers. Not sent through an app this time, but dropped off in person. Peonies, my favorite. Not because he remembered, but because he'd scrolled far enough back in our texts to find where I'd once said it. He knocked, waited, and when Clara answered the door instead of me, he tried to hand her the bouquet. "She's not here," Clara said flatly, even though I was in the kitchen watching. "I know she is," he replied. "Please. Just 5 minutes." But Clara didn't move. She just said, "You had years," then shut the door gently in his face. I didn't flinch. I sat at the table and poured another cup of tea. Watched the petals begin to wilt in the bag where he'd left them on the porch. Nolan was trying now, maybe for the first time, but he was only proving what I'd come to understand. Words aren't proof. And effort given after absence isn't love. It's desperation. He sent a final message that night. "You're the only one I ever really loved. I just didn't know how to show it." I didn't reply, because he was still making it about what he felt, not what he did. And I was no longer interested in being the translator for a man fluent in promises, but illiterate in presence. Healing didn't look like a retreat or a cleanse or some sudden burst of self-love. It looked like regular mornings with no notifications from Nolan. It looked like laughing with Clara over burnt toast. Like sitting alone on the balcony and feeling peace instead of pacing. Like reaching for my phone out of habit, then catching myself and smiling. I started to write again. Not poetry, not love notes, just lists. Lists of things I liked, things I missed, things I wanted. I wrote spontaneous kindness at the top of one page and circled it 3 times. I didn't want grand gestures. I wanted consistency, presence, safety. Clara helped more than she knew. One night, over wine and mismatched pajamas, she asked, "When did you start mistaking beautiful words for love?" The question wasn't cruel, it was clear. And it held a mirror up to all my years of mistaking Nolan's talent for articulation as a measure of his heart. I'd spent years waiting for actions to catch up to words, but they never did, because they weren't meant to. "He wasn't lying," Clara said gently. "He just believed his words were enough, and maybe for him they were, but not for you, not for someone who needed to be seen, not just serenaded." It struck me how much energy I'd spent filling in the blanks. Giving grace where there was only carelessness, making excuses for a man who loved the sound of his own promises but couldn't hold mine in his hands. And then she said something I'll never forget. "Rowan, he wasn't incapable. He was unwilling, and you kept romanticizing his refusal as restraint." That was the night I stopped calling it heartbreak. It was something else, a release, a quiet acknowledgement that not every ending needs an enemy, some just need truth. Gideon was quiet, not in the brooding, unreadable way Nolan had been, but in the way still water is quiet, the way dawn arrives without announcing itself. He didn't come with fanfare or flair. He simply showed up. The first time I really noticed him, it was at the office vending machine. I had dropped my tea bag on the floor and mumbled something tired under my breath. He bent to pick it up, handed it to me, and said, "Long day?" Not as a throwaway question, but like he actually wanted to know. I smiled politely. "Is there any other kind?" He didn't laugh to fill the space. He didn't try to solve anything. He just nodded and said, "Well, you made it through. That counts for something." It was nothing, and yet, somehow, it meant more than every elaborate text Nolan had ever sent. Over the next few weeks, Gideon became a kind of fixture. Never pushy, never loud. If he brought coffee, he remembered I took mine with almond milk. If he asked how I was, he listened with his body, no phone in hand, no glancing away. Just presence. One evening, I found myself in the break room after hours, aimlessly scribbling in my notebook. He passed by, paused, then asked, "Do you ever write for yourself or just for work?" I blinked. "Mostly work these days." He didn't prod, just said, "You should write something selfish. Those are usually the most honest." It stayed with me, not because he was poetic, but because he was paying attention. To my pauses, my patterns. The things I didn't say, I didn't think of him romantically. Not then, not yet. I was still unwinding the vines of a relationship that had choked the parts of me meant to bloom. But Gideon didn't pull at those vines. He just made room. Nolan had said all the right things. He always had. I remembered the way his voice dipped when he called me his person, how he swore he'd never met anyone who understood him the way I did. His words had always been so perfectly placed, like a script rehearsed for maximum emotional effect. But standing across from Gideon now, hearing nothing more than a quiet, "I'm here if you need," I felt more seen than I ever had in Nolan's arms. It was startling, the contrast. Nolan's presence had been all glitter and echo, dazzling at first, but empty when the lights came on. With Gideon, there was no performance. He showed up early to meetings, helped a colleague carry boxes without being asked, checked in on people when no one else remembered. No declarations, no grand gestures, just effort, consistency, intent. I started noticing the small things. How Gideon looked people in the eye, how he never interrupted. How he once remembered that I hated when meetings ran over because I had a standing call with my grandmother on Thursdays, even though she'd passed months ago. When I thanked him for remembering, he just said, "You spoke about her with a lot of love." It stuck. There were no fireworks, no butterflies, just warmth, the kind that creeps in without asking and settles gently in your chest. It was then I realized I had spent years mistaking volume for depth. I had confused poetic declarations with devotion, when in reality, devotion is quiet. It's choosing, every day, in 100 tiny ways to care. And Gideon was showing me that care doesn't have to be shouted to be felt. The porch was smaller than I remembered. The white paint had chipped in more places, and the swing creaked when I sat, just like it used to when I was little. I held the orange in my hands, not yet peeled, and let the skin warm in the sun. The breeze smelled like honeysuckle and something older, something that reminded me of her. I could still see her, my grandmother, in that faded lawn chair, peeling oranges with the softest hands I've ever known. "Watch what a man does, not what he says," she used to say, not with bitterness, but with a kind of sad wisdom that only life can carve into you. Back then, I thought she just didn't understand love, that she was too old, too removed from the way people connected now. But sitting there, fingers sinking into the orange's skin, I finally understood everything she meant. Nolan had said everything I ever wanted to hear, promised forever, promised understanding, promised me, but promises are air. They vanish the second they're no longer convenient. What a man does that stays. Gideon didn't promise, he showed. And I hadn't decided what would come of that, whether it would be friendship or something more, but for the first time, I wasn't clinging to potential. I was living in presence. I was choosing myself not with grand statements, but with little acts of return to my peace, to my intuition, to my grandmother's voice in my head. I peeled the orange slowly, letting the juice run down my fingers. "Watch what a man does," I whispered, placing one slice in my mouth, "not what he says." And this time it wasn't a warning. It was a memory, a lesson, a promise I was making to myself, one I knew I'd keep. The porch didn't creak as much anymore. Or maybe it just didn't bother me now that I understood the weight of silence. Because sometimes silence is full, and I was finally full too. Thank you for watching. Please do not forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe. I love you all.